Okay, we're going to continue where we left off. This will be starting with actually the third of 5 deliverances of Paul. And to see Paul's third deliverance, we're going to review that situation in Thessalonica. And of course, it's described more detailed, in more detail in the lessons about Thessalonica under the microscope, where the Lord stretches out the order of things, the way the gospel was preached, etc., and who believed, and that's all taken step by step. But here in verse, and some of it, the beginning of it is up there in the text, Acts 17, verses 1 through 5. But in the 5th verse there, you can see the Jews which believed not. So it's not talking about the disciples, those that descended from Jacob, but believed what Paul was preaching. It's talking about the Jews which believed not. Moved with envy, they took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren. I often wonder who those certain brethren were. Drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also. So verse 7, whom Jason hath received. And these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, one Jesus. So there's, they remembered part of the gospel of God, but it sounds like they didn't believe it. Verse 8, and they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And verse 9, when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And this other, I'm wondering if that's the same as up there where it said certain brethren. They drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city. And I'm also wondering if that, it says, verse 9, when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. I wonder if Paul was in disguise, if he was surreptitious there about it, and not, they were looking for Paul mainly, but who's this other, he may have been, and we find out in another one, a later deliverance, that he did a similar thing. So I don't know, I'm not preaching that that's what that is Paul, but it could be that that's him. When the brethren, and verse 10, and the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea. So they searched Jason's house and demanded security from him and from the other, but they were looking for, Paul and Silas were still there. It says, the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. So in Thessalonica, we have the third deliverance. The brethren in Acts 17:10 delivered Paul from the Jews which believed not in Acts 17 verse 5. So going on to the fourth deliverance of Paul, before we see Paul's fourth deliverance, let's look at something, explore some of the details given later about Paul's temple vision, because it has to do with this fourth deliverance. In Acts 18:22, the temple vision from Christ to Paul occurred. Acts 18:22. And that reads, and when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. So there's just 3 words for that brief visit. Saluted the church. Uh, Look at Paul's later description of that temple vision in Acts 22. We're talking about what happened in Acts 18, verse 22, and we see in Acts 22, verses 17 and 18, and going on down, we're going to start in 17. And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying unto me, Make haste, get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. Jesus said that to Paul. And I said, Lord, they know that I am in prison, and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. Here again is Paul's temple vision in the King James Bible, Acts 18:22. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone uphill, that would be uphill to Jerusalem, and saluted the church, that's the church in Jerusalem, he went down to Antioch, which is downhill north of Israel, north of Jerusalem. In Acts 22:18 and verses 22 and 21, 18 and 21. Let me say it again. Acts 22 verses 18 and 21. Christ himself delivered Paul by telling him to get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, and then he said to depart. And that single word has to be, it has to have been a forceful command to get Paul out of there before the violence started. In that way, Paul was delivered from they in Acts 22:18, for they will not, that's the they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. They were the apostate Jews in Jerusalem. Apostate. Okay, Paul's fifth deliverance. Paul left Ephesus and went through Macedonia to Greece. Acts 20, starting in the first verse. And after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples. In other words, those that believed Paul's gospel. But they had been in the synagogue. They had been Jews or Greeks coming to God as under the covenants before Paul. So when they heard Paul, they believed, and there were the disciples then, and embraced them. Paul embraced them and departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts and had given much exhortation, he came into Greece. So there was some success going on too, wasn't there? Verse 3, and there abode, talking about in Greece, there abode 3 months. And when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. In other words, he changed his route. Instead of going on down to the docks, he went north and went around the Horn there on land, the land route. He purposed to, we would say he purposely returned through Macedonia. In Acts 20, verse 3, Paul was delivered from the Jews, it says in the text. The Jews laid wait for him. In Acts 20, verse 3, as he purposed to return through Macedonia. Excuse me just a minute. So that was 5 times that Paul was delivered from the Jews, and there were other times too, he was delivered from the shipwreck, etc., and things like that, delivered from the snake bite. The Jews, he was delivered from the Jews in these 5 times. Also called certain Jews. Remember that one time they were called certain Jews. In other words, they were identifiable troublemakers. And they're also called the Jews which believed not in another deliverance. According to Acts 26, verses 16 to 17, that means that it was the Jews to whom Christ sent Paul in his early first sending. Acts 26:17, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, unto whom now I send thee. So Paul's later all men sending was when he was delivered from this world. Well, we'll get into that. Let's discover now when Christ's later sending of Paul began. It was, was Acts 9 the beginning of the gospel of the grace of God? Was that when the gospel of the grace of God began in Acts 9? The gospel by which we are saved today? Well, let's see the beginning of the gospel of the grace of God in Philippians 4:15. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but you only. So it says, in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia. Well, Paul pins it there, doesn't he? Exactly when that gospel began. And we see that departure from Macedonia, we see it in Acts chapter 20, verse 6. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto Troas in 5 days. Incidentally, that's where he spoke all night, the only place he preached all night, where we abode 7 days. Philippi was the chief city of that part of Macedonia, so sailing away from Philippi was sailing away from Macedonia, which was what he said back in Philippians 4:15. He said that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia. That's when Acts 20 verse 6, when he sailed away from Philippi, Macedonia. And after this temple vision, Paul knew he was to preach the gospel of the grace of God to all men, not just to the Jews and the Greeks in Israel's program. So, looking again at Acts 22, starting in verse 17, his second sending verses here, and it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance and saw him. So, in other words, he's saying his attention was focused to this topic that he was seeing. He says, saw him saying unto me, make haste, and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And then Paul argues with the Lord here. And I said, Lord, they know that I am imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, verse 21 here, he said unto me, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices, and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out, and cast off their clothes, and threw dust into the air, So this is, the Lord warned him that they would not receive his testimony, and he left. There was a brief visit. He left and went down to Antioch and traveled around. And this is when he came back to Jerusalem, and he did tell them what the dream, not the dream, the vision, the words from Christ in that vision. And they blew up. They exploded with anger and wrath and tried to kill him again. It's not fit that such a fella, how they put it, away with such a fella from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 18, Paul tells that he is ready to be delivered from this present evil world. Let's look at those verses. Starting in verse 6, for I am now ready to be offered. This is 2 Timothy 4, probably his last words, last chapter. For now I am ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course, and that was his course that we've been looking at tonight. He was sent to the Jew and also to the Greek, and then he said, let me just, before we go on to the rest of that verse, let's look at Acts 20, because there's more to it than just his course. Let me post it here. But none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy. That's what he'd been doing in Acts there, Acts 9 through through Acts 20 here, where he's speaking, just up till verse 6, when he sailed away from Macedonia and the beginning of the gospel. But he says, I count not my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy. And, so here's an additional something, and the ministry which I've received of the Lord. So he's telling them that he's received a ministry from the Lord to testify the gospel of the grace of God. So back over here in 2 Timothy, in this last chapter, he writes, verse 7, I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Verse 8, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. And whichever appearing that means, we love them both. His appearing, that when he appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus and gave him our new gospel by which we're saved. Or if he's talking about his appearing when he comes in the clouds to catch us up to the clouds to take us back to heaven. Take us to heaven. Christ will be going back, but we'll be with him. Well, 2 Timothy chapter 4 down to verse 16. At my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Notwithstanding, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, that by me the preaching might be fully known, and that all the Gentiles might hear. So he's admitting here that all the Gentiles have been preached to, that he has fulfilled that sending to preach to all the Gentiles. And he goes on to say, and I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Verse 18, and the Lord shall deliver me from every evil work, and will preserve me unto his heavenly kingdom, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. In Acts, Paul was delivered from the Jews 5 times. After the end of Acts, all men forsook him, and when Paul was delivered from this life, the Lord delivered Paul, preserving him unto his heavenly kingdom. So in Acts 9, at the time of Paul's salvation, according to Acts 26, verse 17, in Paul's testimony there, before King Agrippa, Christ had sent Paul with the gospel of God to the apostate Jews as well as to the Greeks. The Greeks were not a people. It's not talking about people from Greece. It's talking about people that took up the Greek Empire way of looking at things. It was customary for them to look for the understanding of things, the wisdom and knowledge they sought after, and built libraries to accumulate this knowledge, institutes. And so the Greeks were seekers of the wisdom and knowledge of God. And they blessed God. They feared the God of Abraham and blessed a Jew, or many Jews. Some of them built synagogues for the Jews, even though they were not descended from Jacob. The Greeks knew that they needed to bless Israel to be blessed by God, but they did not yet know that Jesus of Mary was that prophesied Messiah they had been waiting for, and he was the one. And that's the Acts period meaning of Romans 10:12. For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek. For the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. In that dispensation, before Paul came along, that was what they had to do. They had to call upon the name of the Lord. They had to believe that Jesus, well, you can find John had to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. John says that in John 20, verse 30 or 31, I think it's 31, says that that very thing, that they were to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that's what Peter announced in Matthew 16. Matthew 16, verses 15 through about 21, I think it is. But that was the purpose and the function of the gospel of God. The gospel of God made men and people aware that their Messiah had come and had been rejected by the people, by Israel, the Jews, anyway, not the disciples, but the Jews. The gospel of God does not save anyone, but it makes them wise about who Jesus is. It's God's testimony about who Jesus is. In Israel's kingdom program, nobody, Jew or Gentile, could follow God's requirements to become right with God through Israel's covenants. They couldn't keep all the covenants all the time, or the commandments all the time, but anybody, Jew or Gentile, could believe that way, could try to, could come through Judaism to God. Back then, not anymore. They're low am I now. But they could come to God through, whether they were Jews or whether they were God-fearing Greeks who were seeking the wisdom and knowledge of God and blessing Israel. And this confirms the fact that when Paul referred to the Gentiles in Acts 26:17, and also in Romans 11:11, those Gentiles are in the same boat, same situation. He was referring to as Gentiles, he was referring to the God-fearing, Israel-blessing, seekers of wisdom and knowledge of God, often called Greeks in the King James Bible. And I mentioned Romans 11:11. Let's look at that. I say then, have they stumbled? Paul talking about Israel. Yes, they stumbled at the cross. They were prophesied to stumble. They stumbled at the cross. Have they stumbled that they should fall? He's asking a question. Should they have fallen after they stumbled? God forbid. But rather, they didn't have to fall after they stumbled. But rather through their fall, so they did go ahead and fall. They fell by committing the unforgivable sin at the end of the acceptable year of the Lord. Through their fall, salvation is come to, here it is again, the Gentiles. We have to distinguish which Gentiles it came to. For to provoke them, Israel, to jealousy. Well, who could provoke Israel to jealousy? Not the Gentiles that terrorized them, that were against them, had their own gods and didn't care about the God of Israel. Not them. The Gentiles that could provoke Israel to jealousy were the ones sitting in their synagogues week after week, Sabbath after Sabbath. The Greeks and the Gentiles that came to God through Israel. Those are the ones, the Greeks, that are the Greeks and the Jews that Paul is referring to when he uses the term Gentiles, because he wasn't speaking of all the Gentiles yet. Only the Greeks were in the synagogue position so that they could provoke Israel to jealousy and save some of them. Compare Jew and Greek in Romans 1:16 with Jew and Gentile in Acts 26 verse 17. Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Acts 26:16 and 17, but rise, stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness, both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in the which I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, unto whom now I send thee. Throughout Acts, Christ sent Paul to the Jews and the Greeks in the synagogues. Romans 1:1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. When he was separated from his mother religion, he was separated unto the gospel of God. That was what, you can read it in Acts 9:20, Acts 9:22, Acts 9:27, Acts 9:29. Times when Paul preached the gospel of Christ, it says straightway in the synagogues. So those from whom Christ delivered Paul equal the Jews and the Greeks, not the disciples, but the Jews and the Greeks, to whom the gospel of Christ was sent in Acts 26:16 and 17, the ones from whom Paul had to be delivered. In Acts 26:17 we find that the people and the Gentiles are the Jew first. The Gentiles being the Greeks, and also the Greeks in Romans 1:16. What a stark example of the grace of God continuing all that time after they had fallen in Acts 7, continuing to work with the Jews and the Greeks and bring them into the body of Christ. The grace remnant, those that chose grace, elected grace. Why does this matter? If you go into Galatians thinking that you are the ye that he's talking about there, you're going to put yourself back in the synagogues as if you were one of the Jews. No. Paul was talking to that specific group of people, those Jews and Greeks in Galatians. And after he wrote Galatians, he had that temple vision, and he knew that he was going to be sent to all people, like he writes about in the prison epistles, the last 7 epistles that he wrote. Not the last 7 in the order in the Bible, but the last 7 dated ones. But you need to understand. So, and the reason I mentioned those later ones after he had his temple vision is because you hear hints in there of all men going to him going to all men, which he could do anytime he wants. He just wanted to. He just had a sending that he was to concentrate on and make it his goal to reach the Jew first and also the Greek. And then he was sent to all people, starting in Acts 20, verse 6.